Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Ocilla, Georgia. A town so small and so quiet that most people outside the state have never heard of it. A place where neighbors wave from their porches, where the same families have lived on the same streets for generations, where a Friday night cookout among teachers feels like the most ordinary thing in the world. A place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. And certainly not to someone like her. Her name was Tara Grinstead, and on the night of October 21st, 2005, she came home from a gathering with friends, pulled into her driveway, walked to her front door, and vanished from the face of the earth. No goodbye, no warning, no trace. Just a quiet house, a car in the driveway, a purse sitting on the counter, and a dog left alone in the dark. For 11 years, no one was charged. For 11 years, her family woke up every morning without an answer. For 11 years, the people of Ocilla lived inside an unanswered question that slowly, quietly hollowed out the heart of their community. Tonight, we are going to walk through every piece of that story. From the woman Tara was, to the night she disappeared, to the investigation that stretched across more than a decade, to the confession that finally cracked everything open. We are going to take our time. We are going to do this right, because Tara Grinstead deserves nothing less. Tara Faye Grinstead was born on January 26, 1969, in Fitzgerald, Georgia. She grew up in the quiet landscape of South Georgia, surrounded by flat farmland, pine forests, and the particular warmth of small southern communities where everyone knows everyone and a familiar face is never far away. From the very beginning, Tara was the kind of person who drew people toward her without any visible effort. There was a brightness in her that was impossible to manufacture and impossible to ignore. She smiled with her whole face. She laughed easily and genuinely. She remembered the names of your children, the thing you mentioned in passing 3 weeks ago, the detail you shared once and forgot you had shared. She attended Valdosta State University and earned her degree in education. And she returned to South Georgia the way people from small towns so often do, pulled back by family and familiarity, and the particular gravity of the place where you grew up. She joined the faculty at Irwin County High School in Ocilla, where she taught history and served as the coach of cheerleading squad, and she became, in time, one of the most beloved and respected educators the school had ever seen. She was 36 years old in the fall of 2005. She had been teaching at Irwin County High School for over a decade. She had dark hair and warm eyes, and the kind of composed, radiant presence that comes from years of confidence built on genuine accomplishment. She had competed in beauty pageants for years, and had been a Miss Georgia USA contestant, and while the pageant world had given her poise and polish, it was never the core of who she was. The core of who she was existed in that classroom, in the daily work of shaping young lives. Former students speak about her in remarkably consistent terms. Even now, decades later, she was strict but fair. She had high expectations and delivered them with warmth rather than harshness. She knew each student not as a face in a desk, but as a specific person with a specific story and specific potential. She celebrated their successes loudly and supported them through their failures quietly. She stayed after class to help students who were struggling. She attended their games and their performances. She cared, visibly and without reservation, about the young people in her charge. In a small town where the future can feel narrow and options can feel limited, Tara Grinstead was the kind of teacher who made kids believe the world was bigger than what they could see from Ocilla. That is not a small thing. That is everything. To a 17-year-old who doesn't know yet what they are capable of. She lived alone in a modest brick house on Snapdragon Drive, a quiet residential street in Ocilla. She had bought the house herself, a small but meaningful symbol of the independence and stability she had built. She kept it tidy. She had a dog. She had a routine that the people who knew her could set their watches by. She was, by every account, a woman who had made a good life in the place she had chosen to call home. But in the fall of 2005, Tara was also at one of those quiet crossroads that arrive in the middle of your 30s without announcement. She had recently ended a long-term relationship with a man named Marcus Harper. She was navigating the particular loneliness of being a vibrant, deeply social person who had recently found herself without the romantic anchor she had grown accustomed to. She was dating cautiously, moving forward with the kind of quiet optimism that had always been characteristic of her. Among her colleagues, there were whispers that she had been thinking about a career change, that she had been exploring the possibility of joining the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, that she was reaching, as she always was, towards something new. She had plans. She always had plans. On Friday, October 21, 2005, Tara attended a cookout at the home of a fellow teacher. It was a warm October evening in South Georgia, comfortable and easy. The kind of night that makes you feel glad to be alive. Tara was sociable and warm, laughing with colleagues, chatting easily, being exactly who she always was in social settings. Those who saw her that night said she seemed happy. She seemed fine. There was nothing in her manner, nothing in her words that suggested she was afraid or troubled or in any kind of danger. She left the gathering sometime around 11 o'clock in the evening. She got into her car. She drove the short distance home to Snapdragon Drive. She pulled into her driveway. And then the night swallowed her whole. She did not show up for work on Monday morning. That was the first alarm, because Tara Grinstead did not miss work. She was not the kind of person who called in without warning, who left her students without explanation. When she wasn't there on Monday, her colleagues felt it immediately. When she didn't answer her phone, the feeling deepened into something colder and sharper. A colleague drove to her house. The car was in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. Inside, there was no obvious sign of violence, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. But Tara's purse was there. Her keys were there, her dog was there, alone and confused. Everything a woman takes with her when she leaves voluntarily was sitting exactly where she had left it. Tara was not there. The missing persons report was filed with the Ocilla Police Department on Monday, October 24, 2005. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was brought in quickly, and with that, one of the longest and most haunting unsolved cases in the history of Georgia officially began. When investigators arrived at the house on Snapdragon Drive, they began documenting everything with the careful attention that the circumstances demanded. The absence of an obvious struggle was noted, but investigators understood well that a clean scene does not mean an innocent one. Some of the most calculated, most carefully executed crimes leave almost nothing visible in their wake. The absence of chaos can be, in its own chilling way, evidence of a perpetrator who was calm and deliberate and knew exactly what they were doing. Outside the house, investigators found something small and deeply significant: a single latex glove lying near the property. Not Tara's, the kind worn by someone who did not want to leave fingerprints behind, or by someone who had been doing something that required hand protection. In the context of everything surrounding it, that glove was sinister in a way that was impossible to dismiss. It was collected as evidence. It would become one of the most discussed pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation, and years later, it would become something far more important than anyone in those early days could have imagined. Forensic examination of the house itself produced a luminol reaction, indicating that blood had been present and subsequently cleaned. This was significant and deeply disturbing, pointing strongly toward violence having occurred in or near the home. But without a body, without more, it was not enough to charge anyone. It was a direction, a signal, a cold confirmation of what the instincts of everyone who loved Tara already suspected. The GBI flooded the area with agents. Search parties were organized. K-9 units were deployed. Helicopters flew low over the pine landscape of Owen County, scanning the terrain below. Volunteers walked in lines through the woods with long sticks, searching the sandy soil and thick undergrowth of South Georgia for any sign of where Tara might have gone. They found nothing. The community of Ocilla responded with the full force of small-town solidarity. Posters were printed and distributed. The story traveled from local news to regional news to national headlines. A beautiful young schoolteacher, missing without a trace in a small Georgia town. A reward was established, eventually reaching $100,000, one of the largest ever offered in a Georgia missing persons case. Tip lines rang constantly. Investigators followed every lead with the urgency that the early weeks of a major case always generate. Among the first people interviewed was Marcus Harper, Tara's former boyfriend. He was cooperative, he denied involvement, and he provided alibi for the night of October 21st. Investigators were not immediately satisfied, but they were unable to disprove his account sufficiently to move against him. His name, however, would never entirely disappear from the conversation. In the absence of answers, in a town as small and interconnected as Ocilla, the whispers about Marcus Harper persisted for years, becoming part of the quiet, uneasy mythology that grew up around the case. Other possibilities were explored. Random crime. A stranger passing through, someone from Tara's past, some connection not yet visible to investigators. Registered sex offenders in the surrounding area were investigated. Every person in Tara's immediate social circle was looked at. Their movements and their alibis and their relationships to her examined as carefully as the available information allowed. The weeks became months. The forensic evidence, limited as it was, did not generate new leads. The tips continued to come in and continued to lead nowhere definitive. The investigation did not close, it never officially closed, but it shifted from the frantic, all-hands urgency of the first weeks to the slower, steadier rhythm of a long-term case being worked with the resources available. Tara's family refused to let the case fade. Her father, Carlton Grinstead, became the public face of the family's grief and determination, appearing in interviews, pleading for information, keeping his daughter's name in circulation with the tireless, heartbreaking energy of a father who simply would not give up. Her sister Anita took up the cause alongside him, and together they maintained a visible, unrelenting presence that ensured Tara's case remained in the public consciousness even as the years accumulated. By 2007, the case had been featured on national television programs. By 2010, it had been 5 years. By 2015, it had been 10. The reward still stood, the case was still open. But the realistic hope of resolution, for those who had watched it closely, had shifted from the urgent to the faithful, from expectation to prayer. The kind of hope that is less about specific reason and more about the refusal to stop believing. In a community as small as Ocilla, the weight of an unsolved crime is not abstract. It is present in every conversation, in every glance across a church pew, in every moment when someone new to town asks about it, and the locals go quiet in that particular way. It is present in the classroom where Tara's photograph hangs on the wall unchanged, while the students in the desks below it grow up and graduate, and come back as adults with their own children and still stop and look at it, and feel the ache of something that was never resolved. It is present in the heart of every person who loved her every morning without exception. Carlton Grinstead died in 2016. He died with knowing what had happened to his daughter. He died carrying the question that had defined the last decade of his life, the question that had cost him more than anyone who hasn't lived it can fully understand. The answer was close. It was coming. But it came too late for him. That fact, in the full weight of everything that follows, is one of the most quietly devastating in the entire story. In January of 2017, a young man named Ryan Alexander Duke made a confession. Not to police, not in an interrogation room. He confessed to someone he knew in the ordinary, unguarded way that secrets eventually find their way out of the people who have been carrying them too long. And the person who heard that confession made a decision that took courage, real and genuine courage, and reported what they had heard to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. That phone call changed everything. Ryan Duke was 25 years old in 2017. He had grown up in Irwin County. He had attended Irwin County High School. He had walked the same halls that Tara Grinstead had walked, had sat in classrooms not unlike the ones she had taught in. He was, in the way that perpetrators in small-town cases so often are, not a stranger at all. He was someone from inside the community, someone whose face would have been familiar, someone who existed within the same small interconnected world that Tara had inhabited. The GBI moved quickly after receiving the tip. Investigators approached Ryan Duke and confronted him with what they knew. And Duke, faced with the knowledge that someone had spoken, made the decision to confess. What he told investigators was devastating in its specificity. He told them that on the night of October 21st, 2005, he had gone to Tara Grinstead's home on Snapdragon Drive. He had entered the house. He had encountered Tara, and in the course of what followed, he had killed her. He told investigators that he had not acted alone in the aftermath, that another person had helped him dispose of Tara's body, a man named Bo Dukes. The name Bo Dukes landed in the investigation like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Bo Dukes was a man from the same community, the same world, the same tightly woven fabric of Irwin County that had produced Ryan Duke and Tara Grinstead and the whole devastating story. He was someone with connections to Ryan Duke, to the area, to the specific geography of what had happened in the hours after Tara's death. And the nature of his involvement, as it emerged in the weeks and months of legal proceedings that followed, would prove to be as important and as troubling as the crime itself. Ryan Duke was arrested on February 27, 2017. He was charged with murder, aggravated assault, burglary, and concealing the death of another. The arrest, when it was announced, sent shockwaves through Ocilla and through the entire true crime community that had followed Tara's case for years. 11 years of silence, 11 years of waiting, and then suddenly, without any of the dramatic forensic breakthrough or deathbed confession that people had imagined the answer might come from, there was a name. There was a face. There was a person in handcuffs in front of a camera. Tara's sister Anita learned of the arrest. She had spent years fighting to keep the case alive, years of interviews and advocacy and the grinding, daily work of refusing to let her sister be forgotten. When she heard the news, she wept, not entirely with relief, not with anything that's simple, with the complicated, overwhelming emotion of someone who has been waiting for an answer for 11 years and has finally gotten one, and now has to figure out what to do with it. Bo Dukes was arrested shortly after Ryan Duke. He was charged with concealing the death of another, making false statements, and hindering the apprehension of a criminal. The specific nature of his alleged involvement in the disposal of Tara's body, the where and the how, would emerge in the legal proceedings that followed, and it would prove to be one of the most disturbing elements of an already deeply disturbing case. What Ryan Duke told investigators about the night of October 21, 2005. He had gone to Tara's house. He had intended to burglarize it, he said. He had known that the house would be occupied. He had known whose house it was, and what had begun as a property crime had escalated, in the terrible momentum of that night, into something that could never be undone. He described entering the house. He described encountering Tara. He described a struggle. He described the violence that followed. And he described, in the cold language of confession, the moment when Tara Grinstead was no longer alive. He had then called Bo Dukes. And Bo Dukes, according to the account that would emerge in the legal proceedings, had come. He had come and he had helped. He had helped with the disposal of Tara's body on land that the Dukes family owned or had access to in the area. He had helped to burn what needed to be burned. He had helped to bury what needed to be buried. And then he had gone home, and Ryan Duke had gone home, and the house on Snapdragon Drive had sat quiet in the night. And the next day the sun had come up and Ocilla had gone about its business and nobody had known. For 11 years nobody had known. Or rather, someone had known. Ryan Duke had known. Bo Dukes had known. And they had carried it, in their different ways, through 11 years of a community living inside the question of what had happened to Tara Grinstead. The revelation of the disposal site was one of the most painful moments in the entire case for Tara's family and for the community. Remains were recovered on the property where Duke directed investigators. After 11 years, Tara Grinstead was found. What was left of her, what the years and the elements and the deliberate destruction had left, was recovered and identified. She could finally come home. That sentence, she could finally come home, carries an enormous weight. Because coming home in this context means something terrible and something necessary at the same time. It means the end of the not knowing. It means the beginning of something that at least resembles closure, even if real closure, the kind that erases the grief, does not exist. It means a grave with a name on it. It means a place to stand and speak to her, a place to leave flowers, a place that marks the physical acknowledgement that she existed and that she is gone. Carlton Grinstead would never stand at that grave. He was already gone. But Anita would, and the students who had loved their teacher would, and the community that had carried this question for 11 years would. Tara Grinstead was buried in early 2017, after her remains were recovered and identified. She was finally, after everything, laid to rest, but the legal story was only beginning. Ryan Duke's case moved through the Georgia court system over the following years with the particular slowness of a major murder case, motions filed, hearings held, delays accumulated. Duke's defense team mounted a legal strategy that would over time shift and evolve in ways that complicated the picture considerably. Duke had confessed, but in the American legal system, a confession is not always the end of the story. It is, frequently, the beginning of a complicated one. Bo Dukes' case moved on its own track. He was tried separately, and his trial would come first, producing a verdict and a sentence that sent him to prison, and established a legal record of his role in what had happened to Tara Grinstead in the years after her death. And then came Ryan Duke's trial, and with it, a series of revelations and complications and legal maneuverings that surprised nearly everyone who had been following the case. We are going to get into all of that in the next part of this story. We are going to walk through the trials, the testimony, the evidence presented in open court, the verdicts, and the sentences. We are going to talk about what the legal proceedings revealed about the night of October 21, 2005, and about the 11 years that followed. We are going to talk about what justice looked like in this case, and whether it looked like enough. But before we get there, I want to sit for a moment with something that the arrest and the confession and the recovery of Tara's remains made undeniably real way, that the 11 years of searching had not quite managed to make real, even though everyone had suspected it for years. Tara Grinstead did not disappear. She did not leave. She did not make a choice to walk away from her life, her dog, her students, her family. She was killed. She was killed in her own home on a Friday night in October, by a young man who had gone to her house for reasons still, in some ways, not entirely clear, and who had made a series of choices in the darkness of that night that he would spend the rest of his life paying for. And she was hidden. She was taken from her home and hidden on a piece of land in rural Georgia and burned. And the person or persons responsible for hiding her went back to their lives and let 11 years pass, and let a family grieve without answers, and let a community live inside a wound that would not close. That is what happened to Tara Grinstead. That is the plain, terrible truth of it. She was 36 years old. She was a teacher and a coach and a daughter and a sister and a friend and a woman who had made a life she was proud of in a community she loved. She had plans. She had students who needed her. She had people who loved her more than they could say. And she came home on a Friday night and someone was waiting. And that was the end. Ryan Alexander Duke was born and raised in Irwin County, Georgia. He grew up in the same flat, pine-covered landscape that Tara Grinstead had called home. The same small-town world where everybody's business was everybody's business, and where the past had a way of following you down every street you walked. He was not, by any measure, a man who had built a stable or successful life in the years between high school and the night that would define everything that came after. By the time October 2005 arrived, Ryan Duke was in his early 20s, drifting in the way that young men without direction sometimes drift in small towns, caught between the life they grew up in and a future that hadn't taken shape yet. He had attended Irwin County High School. He had walked those same hallways. He had existed in the peripheral way that students exist in relation to teachers they may or may not have had direct contact with, in the same institutional world that Tara Grinstead inhabited every day. Whether he had been in her class, whether they had interacted directly in any meaningful way, whether she had known his name or his face, these are questions that the legal proceedings would touch on without fully resolving in the public record. But he knew who she was. In a town as small as Ocilla, everyone knew who Tara Grinstead was. Bo Dukes was a different kind of figure. He was from the same community, the same general world, but he carried himself with a different energy, louder, more social. more centrally embedded in certain circles that moved through Irwin County and the surrounding area. He and Ryan Duke had a connection, a friendship or association that predated the night of October 21st, 2005, and that would prove to be the link that bound them both to what happened in the terrible hours after Tara was killed. Bo Dukes had family land in the area, rural property that would become central to the most disturbing chapter of the story. The chapter that dealt not with the crime itself, but with what was done afterward. What Ryan Duke told investigators about how he came to be at Tara Grinstead's house on the night of October 21st was, in its initial telling, framed around the idea of burglary. He had gone there to burglarize the home, he said. He had known whose house it was. He had gone in the night wearing gloves, which explained the latex glove found in the yard. And he had not expected her to be home, or had not expected things to go the way they went. And the night had ended with Tara Grinstead dead and Ryan Duke in possession of a secret that would weigh on him for more than a decade. That account, the burglary, gone wrong narrative, would become one of the most contested elements of the entire legal case. Because the question of what Ryan Duke's intentions were when he went to that house, and what had actually transpired inside it, was not a question that a single confession could fully answer. And as the legal proceedings unfolded, as attorneys on both sides put their cases were called and evidence was presented, the picture of what had happened that night became simultaneously clearer and more complicated. The specific manner of Tara's death, as determined through the investigation and the forensic work done on the remains recovered from the Duke's family property, was established and presented in the legal proceedings. The details were, as such details always are, deeply difficult. What had been done to Tara in the moments and minutes of that night, and what had been done to her remains in the hours that followed, were things that the people who loved her had to hear in the clinical, necessary language of the courtroom, and that language, however clinical, did not make the content any less devastating. After Tara was killed, Ryan Duke contacted Bo Dukes. That contact, that phone call in the darkness of an October night, was the moment when the crime expanded from one person to two. When the secret became shared, when the disposal of what had been done became a collaborative act, Bo Dukes came. According to the account that emerged in the legal proceedings, he came and he helped. He brought Ryan Duke to property that the Dukes family had access to in the rural area outside Ocilla. And there in the dark, on land that was far enough from the main road and deeply enough hidden in the Georgia landscape that it would not be found by the searches conducted in the days and weeks after Tara's disappearance, they burned her remains. The burning is, in the full moral accounting of this case, one of the most deliberate and calculated acts of the entire night. Because a fire is not a panic response. A fire requires preparation and time and a specific intention, not just to destroy evidence, but to erase a person. To take a human being who had a name and a face and a life and reduce her to something that could not be identified, could not be brought home. The burning was an act of erasure, and the people who carried it out knew exactly what they were doing. And then they went home, and for 11 years they said nothing. That silence, the 11 years of it, is something that the legal proceedings and the public discussion of this case return to again and again. Because both Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes lived in Irwin County, or in the surrounding area, through those 11 years, they were present in the same community that was grieving Tara's absence. They saw the posters, they heard the news reports. They knew about the reward, they were aware, in the most direct possible way, of the ongoing investigation and the family's pain and the community's unanswered questions, and they said nothing. Bo Dukes, in particular, became a figure of enormous public anger as his role emerged. Because while Ryan Duke was the person who had killed Tara, Bo Dukes had done something that was, in its own way, equally unforgivable in the eyes of many who followed the case. He had taken the secret of where Tara was and carried it for 11 years, while her family grieved without closure and her father aged and died without knowing. He had the answer that everyone was searching for, the answer that Carlton Grinstead spent the last decade of his life looking for, and he kept it. There were accounts, accounts that emerged in the legal proceedings and in the broader public record of the case that suggested Bo Dukes had not kept this secret entirely quietly, that he had spoken about it, in the reckless way that people sometimes speak about terrible things when they believe themselves to be among trusted company. That there were people who had heard things over the years, heard hints or fragments or suggestions that Bo Dukes knew more than he should about what had happened to Tara Grinstead, and who had not come forward. This aspect of the case, the question of who else might have known, and for how long, and why they had not spoken, became one of the most troubling and contested dimensions of the entire story. Because if the pattern of what emerged was accurate, then the secret of Tara Grinstead's fate had not been kept by two people alone for 11 years. It had been carried, in fragments and whispers and half-spoken truths, by a small circle of people who had made the collective decision, for their own reasons, not to come forward. That possibility that more people knew and said nothing while a family suffered is something that the community of Ocilla and the broader public that followed this case never entirely came to terms with. It sits in the middle of the story like a stone, dense and immovable, resistant to the kind of explanation that would make it easier to understand. The person who finally came forward, the person whose report to the GBI in January 2017 set everything in motion, was later identified as Heath Dykes, a man who had heard Ryan Duke's confession and made the decision to report it. That decision, whatever motivated it, whatever it cost him personally and socially, was the decision that brought Tara home. That broke 11 years of silence. That gave Tara's family the answer they had been waiting for. Heath Dykes has spoken publicly about the decision. He described the weight of hearing what he heard and the process of deciding what to do with it. He described knowing that coming forward would have consequences, social consequences, in the interconnected world of a small southern community, and he came forward anyway. And because of that, Ryan Duke was arrested. And because of that, Tara's remains were found. And because of that, whatever incomplete and painful measure of justice was eventually delivered was delivered at all. The arrest of Ryan Duke on February 20, 2017, was announced by the GBI and immediately became national news. The Tara Grinstead case, which had been a staple of true crime discussion for years, erupted back into the headlines with a force that reflected how long and how deeply people had been waiting for this moment. The GBI held a press conference. Agents described the circumstances of the arrest in the careful, measured language of law enforcement presenting a case to prosecute. Ryan Duke appeared before cameras in handcuffs, a young man whose face told nothing of what he was carrying. Bo Dukes was arrested 2 days later, on February 24, 2017. He was charged with concealing the death of another, making false statements to law enforcement, and hindering the apprehension of a criminal. He would eventually face additional charges as the full scope of his involvement became clearer in the legal proceedings that followed. The recovery of Tara's remains from the Dukes family property was conducted by investigators using information provided by Ryan Duke and subsequently by Bo Dukes. The property was in a rural area of Ben Hill County, adjacent to Irwin County, deep in the kind of Georgia landscape that is beautiful in its wildness and vast in its emptiness. Investigators worked carefully and methodically to recover what could be recovered from the site where Tara had been burned. The process was painstaking and, for the investigators and forensic specialists who conducted it, undoubtedly one of the most difficult aspects of a deeply difficult case. What was recovered was limited, as would be expected after the deliberate destruction that had been carried out. But it was enough. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity of the remains as Tara Grinstead. After 11 years, the question of where she was had an answer. Anita Grinstead, Tara's sister, was informed. She had spent years fighting to keep the case alive, years of advocacy and interviews and the grinding, daily work of refusing to let her sister be forgotten. The moment of being told that Tara had been found, that there was now a place and a name and a confirmed end to the searching, was not a moment of simple relief. It was the complicated, overwhelming convergence of grief and resolution that the families of the missing sometimes describe as the worst best day of their lives. The worst because of what was confirmed. The best because the not knowing was over. Tara Grinstead was finally buried. Her family could stand at a grave. They could perform the rituals that human beings use to process loss, the rituals that had been denied them for 11 years. They could say goodbye in the way that human beings need to say goodbye. It was not enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. It was the beginning of a grief that could at least move forward, rather than the frozen, unresolvable grief of not knowing. Carlton Grinstead had died in 2016, just months before all of this. He had died without knowing. That fact remained and remains one of the most quietly devastating truths in the entire story. A father who loved his daughter and looked for her for a decade and died without finding her. The answer was so close. It was coming, it was months away. And he ran out of time. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests were long and complex, as major murder cases always are. Ryan Duke's case moved through the Georgia court system over the following years with the particular slowness of capital litigation. He faced the possibility of the death penalty, which raised the stakes of every motion and every hearing and every procedural development. His defense team worked to admissibility of his confession, to contest the evidence, to build a legal strategy that might, if not secure an acquittal, at least spare his life. Bo Dukes' case moved on a separate track. He was tried first in 2019, and the trial produced a verdict that established a legal record of his role in the aftermath of Tara's death. Bo Dukes was convicted of concealing the death of another and making false statements. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The sentence, when it was announced, was met with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration by those who had followed the case. Satisfaction because he was going to prison. Frustration because the sentence did not reflect, in the view of many, the full weight of what he had done, the 11 years of silence. The destruction of remains, the deliberate erasure of a person who deserved to be found and mourned and buried. But there was more to Bo Dukes' story than the initial charges and conviction. Because in the years between his arrest and his trial, Bo Dukes had said things. He had given statements. He had spoken to people, and what he had said both to investigators and to others painted a picture of those 11 years of silence that was even more disturbing than what had initially been reported. Bo Dukes had spoken about what he knew. Not to authorities. Not in any way that brought the case closer to resolution. But in the social world of Irwin County. In the conversations that happen among people who know each other and share things they shouldn't. There were accounts of Bo Dukes describing, in varying degrees of detail, what had happened to Tara and where she was. Accounts of people who had heard these things and said nothing. Accounts of a secret that had been held not as a tight, carefully guarded thing but as something looser and more terrible. A thing that more than one person knew. Carried in the margins of daily life in a small town while a family looked for their daughter. These accounts were deeply disturbing to the public and to Tara's family. The question of why no one who heard these things had come forward sooner, why the tip that finally broke the case had taken until January 2017 to reach the GBI, was one that the community of Ocilla and the broader true crime audience that had followed the case for years could not easily let go of. The culture of silence in small towns is a real thing. It is not simply cowardice, though cowardice is part of it. It is the complex web of loyalty and fear and social consequence, and the particular way that communities protect their own, even when their own have done the unprotectable. It is the knowledge that speaking up will cost you relationships, standing, safety in some cases. It is the calculation that many people make, consciously or not, when they are in possession of information that would bring tremendous consequences down on people they know. That calculation, made by multiple people over 11 years, cost Carlton Grinstead his last years of life. It cost Tara's family 11 years of unresolved grief. It cost Tara herself the dignity of being found and mourned in anything approaching a timely way. There is no neutral way to state that. It is simply the truth of what happened. Ryan Duke's trial, when it finally came, was one of the most anticipated and closely watched legal proceedings in Georgia's recent history. It had been years in the making. It involved a defendant who had confessed, which might seem to make the outcome straightforward, but in fact made it complicated in ways that the legal proceedings revealed. Because Ryan Duke's defense team, in the years between his arrest and his trial, had developed a strategy that was not simply about contesting guilt, but about contesting the degree of guilt and the circumstances that surrounded it. The defense argued, in essence, that what had happened on the night of October 21, 2005, was not the premeditated murder that the state alleged. They argued that Duke had gone to the house intending to burglarize it, that he had encountered Tara unexpectedly, and that what had followed was not a planned killing but a terrible, impulsive act in the chaos of an encounter that had spiraled out of control. They argued that the circumstances, the intent, the mental state, the specific sequence of events, were relevant to how the crime should be classified and punished. The state argued the opposite. Prosecutors presented evidence and testimony designed to establish that what Ryan Duke had done was murder, that Tara Grinstead had been killed deliberately and violently, and that the 11 years of concealment and the deliberate destruction of her remains were evidence of the cold calculation of a man who knew exactly what he had done and had gone to significant lengths to escape accountability for it. The trial proceeded through days of testimony and evidence. Former investigators testified. Forensic experts testified. The details of Tara's death and the disposal of her remains were laid out in the clinical, necessary language of the courtroom, and the people in that courtroom, including members of Tara's family, heard things that were deeply and permanently painful. And then came the moment that surprised nearly everyone who had been following the case. Ryan Duke, through his defense team, entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to felony murder and other charges, accepting a sentence that would send him to prison for life, but a life sentence rather than the death penalty. The plea deal, negotiated with the state, was accepted by the court. And with that, the question of Ryan Duke's guilt was formally and legally resolved. But the resolution left a complicated aftermath. Because the plea meant that there was no full trial, no complete public airing of all the evidence, no verdict rendered by a jury after full deliberation. The details of exactly what had happened in Tara's house on October 21, 2005, the specific sequence of events, the full truth of Ryan Duke's intentions and actions, were established to the satisfaction of the legal system, but not fully laid out in the public record in the way that a completed trial might have provided. For Tara's family, the plea was a source of complicated feelings. It meant accountability. It meant Ryan Duke would spend the rest of his life in prison. It meant the state had secured a conviction. But it also meant that some questions would remain less than fully answered, that the complete truth of that night was contained in documents and statements not entirely accessible to the public, that the story had ended not with the dramatic finality of a jury verdict, but with the quieter, more ambiguous finality of a negotiated resolution. Tara's sister Anita spoke publicly after the plea. She spoke with the measured, careful dignity of someone who has been through years of grief and advocacy, and who understands that justice, in the real world, is rarely as clean as the stories we tell ourselves about it. She spoke about Tara, about who her sister had been, about the years of fighting to keep the case alive, about what the resolution meant and what it didn't mean and the things that would never, regardless of what happened in any courtroom, be made whole. She spoke, also, about her father, about Carlton Grinstead, who had died without this answer. She spoke about what it would have meant to him. She spoke about the injustice of his dying before the case was resolved, the specific cruelty of a timeline that had brought the answer just months too late for the man who had devoted his last years to finding it. Those words, in the full context of everything that had happened, carried an enormous weight. The question of whether the sentences given to Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes represented justice, real justice, the kind that matches the weight of what was done, is one that reasonable people answer differently. Ryan Duke received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. Bo Dukes received 25 years for his role in concealing Tara's death and destroying her remains. He is in prison. Those are facts. Whether those facts constitute justice for Tara Grinstead, for her father who died without knowing, for her sister who spent years fighting, for the students who loved her, and the community that was changed permanently by her absence? That is a different question, a harder question, one that does not have a clean answer. What can be said is this: the truth came out. After 11 years, after a father died and a community suffered, and a family carried a grief that had no bottom, the truth came out. A young man who had carried a confession for more than a decade finally could not carry it anymore. And he told someone, and that someone made the decision that changed everything. And because of that decision, Tara was found. And because she was found, she was brought home. And because she was brought home, the people who loved her could finally do the things that human beings need to do when they lose someone. That is not nothing. It is not enough. But it is not nothing. We are going to continue this story in the next part, where we are going to go deeper into the details of what was revealed in the legal proceedings, into the specific evidence that was presented, into the testimony that painted the fullest available picture of what happened on the night of October 21st, and in the 11 years that followed. We are going to talk about the unanswered questions that remain, the things that the legal proceedings resolved, and the things they did not. We are going to talk about the impact of this case on the community of Ocilla, and on the broader conversation about cold cases, about the culture of silence in small towns, about what it takes to bring the truth out into the open. And we are going to talk about Tara. Always at the center of everything, Tara. Because the legal proceedings and the arrests and the sentences are all important. They are the machinery of justice, the system working to produce accountability for what was done. But they are not the story. They are the frame around the story. The story is Tara Grinstead, who was 36 years old and full of plans and beloved by her students and her family and her community, and who came home on a Friday night in October and was taken from the world in the dark. The courtroom where Bo Dukes stood to face judgment was a place heavy with years of accumulated grief. It was 2019, 14 years after Tara Grinstead had walked out of that cookout and driven home and disappeared from the world. 14 years of a community holding its breath, and now finally, one of the two men responsible for what had happened to her was standing before a judge and a jury and the full weight of what he had done. Bo Dukes had grown up in Irwin County the way Ryan Duke had grown up in Irwin County, embedded in the social fabric of a small southern community where everyone's history was visible and everyone's connections were known. He was, in the years between Tara's death and his arrest, a man who had lived openly in the community that was searching for her. He had a family. He had social relationship. He moved through the world of Irwin County and the surrounding area with the particular confidence of someone who believed, for more than a decade, that what he knew would never come out. The specific nature of Bo Dukes' involvement in what happened to Tara Grinstead is something that the legal proceedings established with a clarity that was, for those who had followed the case, both illuminating and deeply disturbing. He had not been present at Tara's house on the night she was killed. He had not participated in the act that ended her life. What he had done came after. In the hours that followed Ryan Duke's phone call, in the deliberate and calculated work of destruction and concealment that had kept Tara's remains hidden for 11 years. But the prosecution of Bo Dukes went beyond the physical acts of that night. Because in the years between October 2005 and January 2017, Bo Dukes had done something else. Something that, to many who followed the case, was in its own way as damning as anything he had done on that October night. He had talked, not to authorities, not in any way that might have brought resolution sooner, that might have spared Carlton Grinstead his final years of unanswered grief. He had talked to people in his social circle, in the loose and reckless way of someone who had convinced himself that the secret was safe, that the people he talked to would never say anything, that the walls of small-town loyalty would hold forever. The accounts of these conversations, which emerged in the legal proceedings and in the broader public record of the case, were deeply troubling. There were multiple people who, over the years, had heard Bo Dukes say things that should have sent them to the police. Things specific enough, detailed enough, unmistakably connected enough to the disappearance of Tara Grinstead that anyone hearing them would have understood what they meant. And those people, for their own reasons, had said nothing, had made the calculation that the social cost of coming forward was greater than the moral cost of staying silent, had carried their fragments of the truth through the same years that Tara's family was carrying their unanswered grief. One of the most significant of these accounts came from a woman named Brooke Sheridan, who had been in a relationship with Bo Dukes and who testified that he had told her, in explicit detail, about his role in what had happened to Tara Grinstead. She testified that he had described the burning of Tara's remains, had described the property where it had been done, had spoken about the night in terms that left no ambiguity about what had occurred. She testified that she had lived with this knowledge for a period of time before coming forward, and her testimony painted a picture of Bo Dukes as someone who had not merely concealed what he knew but had, in some moments, seemed almost to need to speak of it, to let the secret out in controlled doses to people he believed he could trust. That dynamic, the compulsive partial disclosure of a secret too large to hold entirely, is something that investigators and psychologists who study violent crime recognize as a pattern. The person who commits or participates in a terrible act and then cannot entirely stop themselves from speaking of it, even while claiming to want it buried. The person who needs someone else to know, even if that knowing creates risk, because the isolation of being the only holder of a catastrophic truth is its own unbearable burden. Bo Dukes in this reading had been cracking for years. The secret had been leaking out of him slowly, through conversations and hints and disclosures, building toward the inevitable moment when someone who heard it would decide that they could not stay silent. The trial of Bo Dukes proceeded through days of testimony and evidence. And what emerged in that courtroom was the fullest public picture yet of what had happened in the hours after Tara's death. The jury heard from investigators who had worked the case for years. They heard from forensic specialists who had examined the property where Tara's remains had been recovered. They heard from witnesses who had, in various ways and at various times, been in possession of information that they had not brought to law enforcement. The picture that assembled itself through this testimony was of a night that had begun with violence and continued with cold, deliberate destruction. Ryan Duke had called Bo Dukes in the aftermath of what he had done. Bo Dukes had come. They had transported Tara's body, or what remained of it, to the rural property in Ben Hill County. They had built a fire. They had burned what they needed to burn. They had spent time on that property in the dark, doing the work of erasure, the work of making a person disappear completely and permanently from the world. The property itself, when investigators finally examined it in 2017, had yielded the fragmentary remains that forensic analysis confirmed as Tara's. 12 years of Georgia weather, of heat and rain and the slow work of the natural world, had reduced what was there to very little. But very little was enough. The forensic work was thorough and careful, and the identification was made with the certainty that Tara's family needed and deserved. The jury in Bo Dukes' trial deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charges against him. He was convicted of concealing the death of another, making false statements to law enforcement, and the related charges that the prosecution had brought. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. When the sentence was announced, the reaction in the courtroom and in the public was divided along the lines that major sentencing decisions in cases like this always divide. There were those who felt that 25 years was appropriate given the specific legal charges he faced, given the distinctions that the law draws between those who commit a crime and those who conceal it afterward. And there were those who felt, just as strongly, that 25 years was nowhere near sufficient for a man who had spent 11 years in possession of the truth about where Tara Grinstead was and had chosen day after day, year after year, to keep that truth to himself. Tara's family, in the statements they made after the sentencing, expressed their own complicated feelings with the same measured dignity that had characterized their public presence throughout the entire legal process. They were grateful for the conviction. They were grateful that Bo Dukes was going to prison. They were not fully satisfied. Full satisfaction in a case like this is simply not available. The law can only do what the law can do. It cannot give back the years. It cannot give Carlton Grinstead back to his family. It cannot give the students of Irwin County High School their teacher back. It can only assign consequence to what was done, and in doing so, provide the incomplete but necessary acknowledgement that what was done was wrong and that it matters. But the Bo Dukes conviction was not the end of the legal story. It was, in some ways, only the beginning of the most complicated chapter, because the question of Ryan Duke's ultimate legal fate was still unresolved, and the proceedings that surrounded his case over the following years would prove to be some of the most surprising and controversial in the entire history of the Tara Grinstead case. Ryan Duke had been arrested in February 2017. He had confessed. He had directed investigators to the site where Tara's remains had been found. He headed the immediate aftermath of his arrest, cooperated with investigators in ways that had been essential to the recovery of Tara and the prosecution of Bo Dukes. All of this might have suggested that his legal path would be relatively straightforward, that the combination of a confession, physical evidence, and the recovery of the victim's remains would produce a swift and decisive resolution. But the American legal system is rarely straightforward, and Ryan Duke's case was no exception. In the years between his arrest and his eventual trial, Duke's legal team worked to challenge the circumstances of confession, to contest the admissibility of various pieces of evidence, and to develop a defense strategy that would, if not secure his release, at least preserve his life. The state of Georgia had sought the death penalty in his case, and that possibility, that Ryan Duke might be executed for what he had done to Tara Grinstead, was the shadow that fell over every development in the legal proceedings for years. The defense raised questions about the conditions under which Duke's initial confession had been obtained, about whether he had been properly advised of his rights, about whether the statements he had made to investigators were legally admissible. These are standard elements of criminal defense in high-stakes cases, and they do not, in themselves, indicate anything improper. The defense of a person facing the death penalty is supposed to be aggressive. It is supposed to challenge everything. That is how the system is designed. What was less standard, and what generated significant controversy among those following the case, was the direction that the defense's narrative began to take as the proceedings moved forward. Because in the years between his arrest and his trial, a different account of what had happened on the night of October 21, 2005, began to emerge from the defense. An account that differed from the initial confession in ways that were significant, and to many observers deeply troubling. The defense began to suggest, in various legal filings and public statements, that Ryan Duke had not been the primary actor in what had happened to Tara Grinstead, that Bo Dukes had played a more central role than the initial accounts had indicated, that the relationship between the two men and the specific sequence of events on the night of October 21st, and in the hours that followed, was more complicated than the straightforward narrative that had initially been presented. This suggestion, this implied or stated redistribution of responsibility between Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, was explosive. It generated immediate and intense response from the public, from the true crime community that had followed the case, and from Tara's family, who had already gone through the trial and sentencing of Bo Dukes, and were now being confronted with the possibility that the story they'd heard in that courtroom was not the complete story. The tension between the accounts of Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, between what each man said the other had done, became one of the defining features of the legal proceedings in the years leading up to Ryan Duke's trial. Each man, facing his own legal consequences, had an incentive to minimize his own role and to emphasize the role of the other. And in the space between their competing accounts, the full truth of that October night remained partially obscured, visible in outline but not in every detail. What is not in dispute, and what was established through the physical evidence in the forensic work and the recovery of Tara's remains, is that both men were involved in what happened to Tara Grinstead and in the disposal of her body. Both men played roles in what was done that night and in the 11 years of concealment that followed. Those are facts that neither man's legal strategy could erase, because the evidence supporting them was physical and forensic, and utterly indifferent to the competing narratives of the men it implicated. The question of who did what, of the precise distribution of action and responsibility between Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, was one that the legal system would address in Ryan Duke's trial. And that trial, when it finally came, would contain a development that surprised nearly everyone who had been following the case for years. But before we get to Ryan Duke's trial and the development that changed the legal landscape of the case, I want to go back to Tara. Because in all the legal complexity and all the procedural developments, and all the competing narratives, it is easy to lose sight of what all of this was about. And what all of this was about was a woman who was killed in her own home on a Friday night in October, and who deserved and still deserves to be the center of the story. Tara Grinstead had been found. Her remains had been recovered from the rural property in Ben Hill County and formally identified. Her family had been notified. She had been brought home, or as close to home as the circumstances allowed. She had been buried. Those steps, painful as they were, had been taken, but the process of being found, of being identified, of being brought home and buried, had also required Tara's family to confront, in concrete and unavoidable terms, what had been done to her. The forensic process, the identification of remains, the examination of what could be recovered after 12 years, and a deliberate attempt at destruction, had forced the people who loved her to understand in the most physical and specific terms possible what the last hours her life had looked like, and what had been done to her afterward. That confrontation, that forced understanding of the physical reality of what happened to someone you love, is a particular kind of trauma that the families of homicide victims carry in ways that are difficult to describe to haven't experienced it. It is one thing to know intellectually that someone you love was killed. It is another thing entirely to sit in a courtroom or in a meeting with investigators and hear the specific details, the clinical language of forensic pathology and crime scene reconstruction that describes what was done to them. That is a different kind of knowing, a more permanent, more physical kind of knowing that settles into the body and stays there. Tara's family went through that. In the investigations and the legal proceedings, and the victim impact statements and the courtroom testimony, they heard things about the last hours of Tara's life that no family should ever have to hear. They heard it because they had to, because the legal process requires it, because accountability for what was done requires that what was done be stated plainly and in full. And they carried it with the same dignity and determination that had characterized their entire long journey through this case. Anita Grinstead, in the years since the arrests and the trials, has spoken publicly about what the resolution of the case meant and what it didn't mean. She has been honest about the complexity of her feelings, about the ways in which having answers is better than not having answers, and the ways in which the answers themselves are painful in their own right. She has talked about her father, about what it meant to finally be able to tell him, in the conversations she has with his memory, that Tara was found. She has talked about the students, about the community, about the ongoing work of honoring her sister's memory in ways that go beyond the legal proceedings. She has also spoken about the things the legal proceedings did not resolve, the questions that remain unanswered or only partially answered, the parts of the story that the competing narratives and the legal strategies and the incomplete public record have left in shadow. Because there are parts of this story that are still not fully clear, even after everything that has happened in the years since January 2017. The full truth of what happened inside Tara's house on the night of October 21, 2005, the specific sequence of events, the exact nature of what Ryan Duke did and why, the precise circumstances that turned whatever he came to that house intending to do into what actually happened, is known to Ryan Duke and has been described in legal documents and testimony, but has not been fully and completely laid out in the public record in the way that a complete trial might have provided. The question of whether others knew more than they admitted, whether the circle of people with some knowledge of what had happened to Tara was larger than the two men who were ultimately charged, is a question that the legal proceedings touched on but did not fully resolve. The accounts of Bo Dukes speaking about his knowledge to multiple people over the years, the testimony about what various people had heard, and when raised questions about the culture of silence that had surrounded this case for 11 years. Questions that were disturbing and, for the community of Ocilla, deeply personal. And the question of exactly what Ryan Duke's intentions were when he went to Tara's house. Whether this was truly a burglary gone wrong or something else. Whether there was more to his relationship with or knowledge of Tara than the initial account suggested, was a question that the defense's evolving narrative had raised, and that the ultimate resolution of the case, through a plea rather than a completed trial, had left somewhat less than fully answered. These unresolved questions are the shadow that falls over the legal resolution of the Tara Grinstead case. They do not change the fundamental facts. They do not change what happened to Tara or who was responsible. But they represent the gap between the legal truth, the truth established in courts and in formal proceedings, and the full truth, the complete and detailed accounting of everything that happened, that Tara's family and the public have not entirely received. That gap is common in criminal cases. It is one of the frustrations that families of victims frequently express, the sense that the legal process is designed to establish culpability and assign punishment, but is not necessarily designed to produce a complete and public narrative of what happened. The law is not a storytelling institution. It is an accountability institution, and those two things, while related, are not the same. As Ryan Duke's case continued to move through the courts in the years after Bo Dukes' conviction, the developments that became increasingly significant and increasingly surprising. The defense's evolving account of what had happened, the questions raised about Bo Dukes' role, the legal challenges to the admissibility of evidence, and the circumstances of the confession. All of these were building toward a trial that promised to be one of the most consequential and closely watched legal proceedings in Georgia in recent memory. And then, in a development that was both expected and surprising in its specific form, Ryan Duke entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to felony murder in the first degree and other charges. The plea was accepted by the court. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty, which the state had sought, and which had been the shadow over the case from the beginning, was taken off the table. The plea meant that Ryan Duke would never walk free. It meant that he would spend the rest of his natural life in a Georgia prison, separated from the world by walls and time, and the irreversible consequence of what he had done on the night of October 21st, 2005. It meant, in the formal and final language of the legal system, that justice had been done. But the plea also meant there was no complete trial, no full presentation of all the evidence, no verdict rendered by a jury after deliberation, no public airing of every detail, every piece of testimony, every contested fact. The story of what had happened to Tara Grinstead was closed legally by a document signed in a courthouse rather than by the pronouncement of a jury. For Tara's family, this was complicated. They had waited years for accountability. They had gotten it. Ryan Duke was going to prison for the rest of his life. But the process by which that accountability had been achieved had not given them everything they had hoped for. The complete, public, detailed truth of what had happened to Tara on that October night remained, in some respects, still partially in shadow. Anita Grinstead spoke after the plea. She spoke about her sister. She spoke about what the resolution meant. She spoke with the honesty and the measured dignity of someone who has been honest, and has come out the other side not unscathed but intact, not satisfied but resolved. She spoke about continuing to honor Tara's memory, about the foundation that had been established in Tara's name, about the work of keeping her sister's story alive in ways that went beyond the legal proceedings and touched the lives of the students and the community that Tara had loved. The Tara Grinstead Foundation, established in the years after her disappearance, had become a meaningful and tangible expression of the community's love for her, and the determination to ensure that her legacy extended beyond the circumstances of her death. The foundation provided scholarships for students, the kind of students that Tara had devoted her career to helping. Students in small southern towns who needed someone to believe in their potential, and to help them reach beyond the world they could see from where they were standing. It was, in the fullest sense, a tribute to who Tara was, not to how she died, not to the crime that had been committed against her, but to the life she had done and the difference she had made. The foundation was a way of saying that Tara Grinstead was more than a victim. She was a teacher, a mentor, a woman who had changed lives, and those changed lives could continue to change other lives in her name. That is the legacy that the people who loved her chose to build. In the face of everything, in the wreckage of what had been done to her in the years of grief and the incomplete resolution of the legal proceedings, they chose to build something that honored the best of who she was. And the students, the ones who had been in her class and sat in her cheerleading practices and felt the specific warmth of her attention and her belief in them, they carried her with them. They named their children after her. They dedicated graduations and achievements to her memory. They talked about her to their own students, to their own children, in the way that people talk about the people who shaped them, the people whose influence runs so deep that it becomes indistinguishable from who you are. That is what Tara Grinstead was. That is what she remained, even after everything. Not just a case, not just a headline, not just a name on a missing poster fading in the Georgia sun, a teacher, a mentor. A woman who loved the young people in her care with a fierceness and a generosity that left permanent marks on everyone she touched. She deserved every year that was taken from her. She deserved to see her students graduate and get married and have children. She deserved to find out what the next chapter of her own life looked like, the career change she had been considering, the future she had been reaching toward with the characteristic forward motion of a woman who was never entirely finished growing. She deserved all of that and more, and she did not get it. She got 36 years. 36 years of a life lived fully and warmly and with great love and great impact. And then a Friday night in October, and a young man with a latex glove and the dark. We have more to cover in this story. We still need to talk about the full details of the legal proceedings and what they revealed, about the specific evidence presented in the trials, about the ongoing questions that the resolution of the case left behind, and about what the Tara Grinstead case means in the broader context of cold cases and small-town silence in the long, uneven arc of justice. We still need to talk about Marcus Harper, whose name was attached to suspicion for more than a decade, and whose story in the aftermath of the case raises its own important and complicated questions about what it means to be suspected of something you did not do in community that does not forget. We still need to talk about the impact on Ocilla, on the community that lived inside this story for 11 years and came out the other side changed in ways that are both visible and invisible. And we still need to talk about what the case revealed about the specific vulnerabilities that allowed a terrible crime to remain unresolved for over a decade. The particular combination of small town culture and limited resources and human silence that created the conditions under which a woman could be killed and in her killer could walk free for 11 years. All of that is coming. But for now, I want to end this part of the story with Tara, with the image of her in that classroom standing in front of her students, believing in them with a force and a specificity that they could feel in their bones. The way she said your name, the way she paid attention, the way she made you feel, even if you were 17 and uncertain and unable to see past the edges of the small town you'd grown up in, like the world was wide and you were capable of crossing it. That is who we are talking about. That is who was taken. And that is why the 11 years of silence, and the people who maintained that silence, and the culture that made that silence possible, are not footnotes in this story. They are part of the story. They are part of what happened to Tara Grinstead, just as much as the night itself. Marcus Harper had lived for more than a decade under a cloud that was not of his making. From the earliest days of the investigation into Tara Grinstead's disappearance, his name had been one of the first to surface, one of the first to be attached to the quiet, persistent whisper of suspicion that moves through a small community when something terrible happens and no one has been charged. He was her former boyfriend. He was someone who had been close to her, who had known her intimately, who had been part of her life in the years before she disappeared. in the absence of answers, in the vacuum that an unsolved case creates. His name had filled the space that facts could not. He had been interviewed by investigators multiple times in the years following Tara's disappearance. He had cooperated. He had denied involvement. He had provided an alibi for the night of October 21, 2005, and while investigators had looked at him carefully and repeatedly, they had never been able to develop sufficient evidence to charge him with anything. The investigation had moved on, in the way investigations do when the evidence does not support a prosecution. But the whispers in Ocilla had not moved on. In a town as small and interconnected as Ocilla, whispers do not require evidence. They require only proximity and the human tendency to fill uncertainty with suspicion. For more than 11 years, Marcus Harper lived with that. He went about his life in the community where Tara's disappearance was a constant, living presence, where her face looked out from photographs and her name came up in conversations, and the question of what had happened to her was never entirely absent from the air. He lived with the knowledge that people looked at him and wondered. That his name appeared on internet forums and in the quiet conversations of people who had theories. That a significant portion of the people in his world believed, without evidence, that he was responsible for something he had not done. The arrest of Ryan Duke in February 2017 resolved the question of who had killed Tara Grinstead. It resolved it in the most definitive possible way, with a confession and a guilty plea and a life sentence, and it released Marcus Harper from the cloud that had followed him for more than a decade. Officially, formally, in the eyes of the law and the investigative record, he was cleared. The answer had been found, and it was not him. But being officially cleared and being practically cleared in the social world of a small southern town are not the same thing. The damage done by 11 years of suspicion does not dissolve with a press release. The whispers that had attached themselves to Marcus Harper's name over those years did not simply stop because the real answer had arrived. The human tendency to hold on to a theory, to resist revising a firmly held belief even in the face of contradicting evidence, meant that some portion of the people who had suspected Harper continued to carry some version of that suspicion even after Ryan Duke confessed. Harper himself, in the statements he made in the aftermath of the arrests, spoke about what those 11 years had cost him. He spoke about the weight of being suspected of something you did not do. In a community where you could not escape the suspicion, where it was present in every glance and every conversation and every moment of daily life. He spoke about the impact on his relationships, on his professional life, on his sense of himself and his place in the community. He spoke with a combination of relief and grief. Relief that the truth had finally come out and grief for the years that had been spent living inside the wrong story. His experience is an important part of the broader accounting of what the Tara Grinstead case cost. It is easy in cases like this to focus exclusively on the primary victims, the person who was killed and the family that lost them. And that focus is right and necessary. Tara and her family are the center of this story and must remain the center. But the ripples of a crime like this extend outward in ways that touch many lives, and Marcus Harper's experience of 11 years is part of the full human cost of what Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes did. Not just killing Tara and hiding her, but leaving the question unanswered long enough for an innocent man to live inside the wrong story for more than a decade. The investigation itself, in the years between Tara's disappearance and the arrests, had consumed enormous resources and human energy. The GBI had worked the case continuously. Even as other cases competed for attention and resources, individual investigators had carried Tara's case as a personal commitment, a professional determination that this woman's fate would not remain unresolved. There are people in the GBI and in Georgia law enforcement whose careers were shaped in part by this case, who returned to it again and again over the years, who kept the file active and the evidence preserved, and the institutional memory of the investigation alive, when the public attention had moved on. Those investigators, when the arrests were finally made, spoke about what the resolution meant to them. They spoke with the particular, restrained emotion of law enforcement professionals who have invested years in a case and have finally seen it move toward accountability. They spoke about Tara, about what it meant to finally be able to tell her family that they had found the answer, about the specific satisfaction, imperfect and complicated as it was, of seeing a case that had defined part of their careers finally reach a form of resolution. The GBI also spoke publicly about the specific factors that had prolonged the investigation, the specific challenges that had made this case so difficult for so long. The absence of a body had been the single most significant obstacle. In homicide investigations, the body is typically the foundation of the forensic case. It provides cause of death, it provides physical evidence, it provides the biological material that links a perpetrator to the crime in ways that are both powerful and admissible. Without a body, the Tara Grinstead investigation had been working with one hand tied behind its back for 11 years. The deliberate destruction of her remains had been, as investigators acknowledged, one of the most effective acts of evidence suppression in the entire case. The latex glove found near the house, which had been one of the most discussed pieces of physical evidence for years, took on new significance after the arrests. DNA testing conducted on the glove in the years after 2005, using increasingly sophisticated technology, had eventually produced results that were significant. The technology available in 2017 was substantially more powerful than what had been available in 2005, and the improvements in low copy number DNA analysis and forensic genetics had made it possible to extract meaningful profiles from samples that would have been insufficient in the earlier years of the investigation. The glove had been preserved carefully, waiting for the technology to catch up with the evidence, and when it did, what it yielded became part of the case against Ryan Duke. This is an important point in the broader context of cold case investigations. The preservation of physical evidence, even evidence that cannot be fully analyzed at the time of collection, is one of the most important things that investigators can do in the early stages of a major case. The forensic technology of today is vastly more powerful than the forensic technology of 15 or 20 years ago, and evidence that was collected carefully and preserved properly in the early 2000s can, in the 2020s, yield results were simply not achievable when it was first collected. The latex glove in the Tara Grinstead case is an example of this principle in action, and it is a principle that has implications for cold cases across the country. The luminol reaction detected in the house in the early days of the investigation had also been preserved in the investigative record, and the significance of that finding became clearer in the context of the full story that emerged after the arrests. The blood that had been present and cleaned from Tara's house was consistent with what had been described in Ryan Duke's account of what had happened there. The cleaning, the attempt to remove the physical evidence of what had been done, was another element of the deliberate and calculated effort at concealment that had characterized the immediate aftermath of Tara's death. The rural property in Ben Hill County where Tara's remains had been burned and buried became, after the arrests, the subject of extensive forensic examination. Investigators worked the site with the care and patience that the circumstances demanded, documenting everything, recovering everything that could be recovered. The work was difficult and emotionally taxing for everyone involved. The site was, in the language of forensic investigation, a secondary crime scene. The place where evidence of the primary crime had been disposed of, and the examination of it was conducted with the same rigor and attention that would be brought to the primary scene. The recovery of Tara's remains from that site, the forensic identification of those remains, and the formal notification of her family were steps in a process that was simultaneously necessary and deeply painful. Each step moved the legal case forward. Each step also forced Tara's family to confront, in increasingly specific and physical terms, what had been done to her. The two things, the legal necessity and the human cost, moved together through the aftermath of the arrests in a way that was impossible to separate. The community of Osceola received the news of the arrests with the complicated mixture of emotions that a long-awaited answer always produces. There was relief, genuine and deep, that the question had finally been answered, that names had finally been attached to what had been done to Tara. There was grief, renewed and freshened by the specific details that emerged in the immediate aftermath. The knowledge of how she had died, and what had been done to her remains and the specific geography of where she had been hidden. There was anger directed at Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes and, in various degrees and directions, at the culture of silence that had made 11 years of concealment possible. And there was something else, something harder to name. A reckoning with the community itself, with the question of what it meant that this had happened in Ocilla, that the people responsible had lived among them, that the secret had been carried and partially shared in the social world of their community for more than a decade. That reckoning was uncomfortable and necessary, and, for many people in Ocilla, the small town culture of South Georgia is not monolithic. It is warm and generous and community-minded in ways that are genuinely admirable. It produces people of great loyalty and great generosity and great care for one another. But it also produces, in certain circumstances, the conditions for exactly the kind of silence that had surrounded the Tara Grinstead case for 11 years. The loyalty that binds a community together can, in its shadow form, become the silence that protects people who should not be protected. The insularity that makes a small town feel safe and known can, in its shadow form, become the wall that keeps the truth from coming out. Ocilla had to look at that shadow. In the aftermath of the arrests, in the public discussion of who had known what, and when and why they had not spoken, the community was confronted with questions about itself that were not comfortable. Questions about why the tip that finally broke the case had taken until 2017 to reach the GBI. Questions about the people who had heard Bo Dukes speak about his knowledge over the years and had said nothing. Questions about what the culture of the community had made possible, that should not have been possible. Those questions did not have clean answers. They do not have clean answers now. But they are important questions, and the fact that the community of Ocilla was willing to ask them, even at the cost of the discomfort involved, is itself a form of reckoning. A form of taking responsibility, not for what had been done to Tara, but for the conditions that had allowed it to remain unresolved for so long. The broader true crime community that had followed Tara's case for years responded to the arrests with its own complex mixture of emotions. The case had been a staple of true crime discussion, appearing on podcasts and YouTube channels and online forums and television programs for years. The people who had followed it, who had theorized and debated and speculated and advocated, felt the specific satisfaction of a long-running mystery finally resolved and the specific grief of a resolution that confirmed the worst. The answer was not a surprise, not in its broad outlines. But confirmation is different from suspicion, and the specific details that emerged in the aftermath of the arrests were, for many who had followed the case closely, more disturbing than even the darkest theories had anticipated. The role of social media and the internet in keeping Tara's case alive during the years of its investigation is worth acknowledging. The true crime community, which had grown enormously in the years between 2005 and 2017, had kept Tara's name circulating in ways that traditional media alone might not have sustained. Online forums had debated the case endlessly, had preserved institutional knowledge about the investigation, had kept the pressure on for answers in ways that were both helpful and, occasionally, harmful. The speculation about Marcus Harper, the long years of internet discussion that had kept his name attached to suspicion, was one of the ways in which the true crime community's engagement with the case had caused real harm to a real person. That is part of the accounting too. In the months that followed the arrests, as the legal proceedings against Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes began to move through the courts, the public attention on the case remained intense. Media coverage was extensive. National news programs returned to Ocilla. The story of the arrest, the confession, the recovery of remains, was told and retold in every available format. And through all of that coverage, through all of the reporting and the analysis and the commentary, Tara's family maintained the presence and the dignity that had characterized their public engagement with the case from the very beginning. Anita Grinstead was everywhere, speaking about her sister with the love and the specificity of someone who had known her all her life and had spent years fighting to ensure that the world remembered her as a person rather than simply as a case. She talked about Tara's laugh, about her teaching, about the specific way she had with students, the way she had made one feel seen and valued and capable. She talked about the holidays, about the family gatherings, about the particular shape of the hole that Tara's absence had left in the family's life for 11 years. She talked about her father, about Carden Grinstead, who had spent the last decade of his life looking for his daughter and had died months before the answer arrived. She talked about what it meant to know, to finally know, and to know that he had not gotten to know. She talked about it with a grief that was specific and raw and entirely real. And the people who heard her could not miss the full weight of what she was carrying. The foundation that had been established in Tara's name continued to grow in the aftermath of the arrests and the trials. Scholarships were awarded. Community programs were funded. The name Tara Grinstead was attached to something living and forward, looking and generative. Something that was changing the lives of students in South Georgia, in exactly the way that Tara herself had changed lives when she was alive. That is one of the ways that people survive the unsurvivable. They build something. They take the grief and the anger and the love and the years of fighting, and they build something that the person who was taken would have been proud of. Something that carries their name forward not in sorrow but in purpose. The Tara Grinstead Foundation is that something, and it is, in the fullest sense, a tribute to who she was and what she valued, and what she gave to the world in the 36 years she had. Let us talk now about the specific details of what Ryan Duke revealed in his confession, and in the subsequent legal proceedings about the night of October 21, 2005. Let us walk through the timeline as carefully as the available information allows, because understanding what actually happened that night is important both for the full accounting of the case, and for the understanding of how such a terrible thing could have gone undetected for so long. Ryan Duke had gone to Tara's house on Snapdragon Drive in the late hours of October 21, 2005. He was wearing gloves, the latex gloves that would leave one behind as evidence in the yard. He entered the house. The exact means of entry, whether through an unlocked door, a window, or some other point of access, was established in the investigation, but the specific details were part of the protected evidentiary record, rather than the fully public account. What is known is that he entered the house and that Tara was there. She had come home from the cookout. She was in her house in the ordinary, unguarded state of a person as home for the night, who has no reason to expect danger, who is moving through the familiar spaces of her own life with the ease of someone who feels safe. The contrast between her state, ordinary and unguarded and safe, and what was about to happen is one of the most painful elements of the reconstruction of that night. The encounter between Ryan Duke and Tara Grinstead, whatever its specific sequence, ended with Tara dead. The manner of her death, the specific act or acts that caused her to die, was established forensically and described in the legal proceedings. It was violent. It was the kind of thing that happens quickly in the specific physics of one human body against another. But that lasts forever in the lives of everyone who loved the person who died. Ryan Duke, in the aftermath of what had happened, did not flee. He made a phone call. He called Bo Dukes, and Bo Dukes came. That decision to call someone rather than to flee or to turn himself in was the decision that created the second layer of the crime. That was the decision that turned a terrible act committed by one person into a shared secret carried by two, and in some ways by more than two, across 11 years. What Bo Dukes did when he arrived is what he was convicted of. He helped to move Tara. He helped to transport her to the rural property in Ben Hill County. He helped to build the fire. He helped to ensure that what was left of Tara Grinstead was as thoroughly destroyed and as thoroughly hidden as it was possible to make it in the dark on October night in rural Georgia. And then both men went home, and the sun came up on October 22, 2005, and the world went on without Tara Grinstead in it, and for 11 years that was how it remained. The question of why Ryan Duke went to Tara's house that night, the question of what his true intention was, remains one of the more contested elements of the case. The initial account, the burglary narrative, was accepted in the broad outlines of the legal proceedings, but was challenged and complicated by various details and emerged over the course of the investigation and the trials. the specific nature of his relationship to Tara, whether he had known her personally, whether there was a history or a connection that informed his presence at her house that night, was something that the legal proceedings touched on without fully resolving in the public record. What is clear is that he chose her house. He went to a specific address on Snapdragon Drive, the home of a specific woman on a specific night. Whether that choice was random or targeted, whether it reflected knowledge of the property as a potentially empty house to burglarize or some other motivation entirely, is a question that the competing legal narratives of the case never fully and publicly settled. That ambiguity is one of the lasting difficulties of a case resolved through a plea rather than a completed trial. A trial would have required both sides to present their full accounts, to subject those accounts to cross-examination and challenge, to lay out all of the evidence before a jury that would then render a verdict based on everything it had heard. The plea bypassed that process. It produced accountability without necessarily producing complete public clarity for the people who loved Tara. That incomplete clarity is one of the things they have had to learn to live with. Not with full ignorance, not with the 11 years of complete not knowing that preceded the arrests, but with a form of partial knowing that answers the most essential questions, while leaving some of the deeper ones in shadow. We are going to talk in the next part of this story about the aftermath of the legal proceedings, about the sentences that were served, and the appeals that were filed, about the ongoing life of the case in the legal system and in the public consciousness. We are going to talk about what happened to Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes in the years after their convictions, about the appeals and the challenges, and the legal developments that continued to emerge even after the guilty pleas and the verdicts. We are going to talk about what the Tara Grinstead case means in the context of cold case investigations across the country, about what it teaches us about the conditions under which crimes remain unsolved and the conditions under which they are finally resolved. We are going to talk about the specific lessons that investigators and advocates have drawn from this case, about the improvements in forensic technology and cold case methodology that have been informed by what happened in Asila. And we are going to keep coming back to Tara, because she is the reason all of this matters. Not as a case study, not as an example, not as a data point in a broader analysis of cold case investigations. As a person. As a woman who loved her students and her community and her family and her life, and who deserved every year that was taken from her, and who deserves to be remembered in her fullness and her warmth and her specific, irreplaceable humanity. The legal aftermath of the Tara Grinstead case did not end with the guilty pleas and the sentencing hearings. In the American legal system, a conviction is rarely the final word, and in a case as significant and as closely watched as this one, the period following the formal legal resolution was as complicated and as consequential as anything that had come before it. The appeals process, the post-conviction proceedings, the ongoing legal maneuvering that both Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes engaged in through their respective attorneys in the years after their convictions. All of this continued to unfold in the courts and in the public record long after the headlines had moved on to other stories. Bo Dukes, serving his 25-year sentence, did not accept the outcome of his trial quietly. He filed appeals. He contested aspects of his conviction through the post-conviction legal channels available to him, challenging the admissibility of evidence, the conduct of the proceedings, the specific legal determinations that had led to his conviction. Those challenges worked their way through the appellate courts with the slowness that characterizes the post-conviction process, producing rulings and counter-rulings and the ongoing legal conversation that is part of the machinery of a justice system that provides multiple layers of review. But the most significant development in Bo Dukes' post-conviction legal story was something that emerged not from a formal legal proceeding, but from something far more human and far more disturbing. In the period after his conviction and sentencing, additional information came to light about the things Bo Dukes had said and done in the years between Tara's death and his arrest. Information that expanded the picture of just how widely the secret of what had happened to her had been shared, and how many people had been in possession of some version of the truth without bringing it to law enforcement. The accounts that had emerged during the trial, the testimony about Bo Duke speaking to multiple people over the years about his knowledge of Tara's fate, were only part of a larger pattern that investigators and prosecutors continued to develop in the years after the conviction. There were conversations that had taken place at parties, at gatherings, in the casual social world of Irwin County and the surrounding area, in which Bo Dukes had said things that anyone hearing them would have understood, things that connected directly and unmistakably to the disappearance of Tara Grinstead, things that multiple people had heard and processed and chosen not to report. The specific number of people who had heard these things and said nothing is not a matter of public record with any precision. But the picture that emerged from the post-conviction investigation and from the various accounts that surfaced in the years after the arrests was of a secret that had been held not as a tight, carefully contained thing, but as something that had seeped out slowly through the social fabric of a community, touching more lives than the two men who had been charged. A secret known in fragments and whispers by a number of people who had made the collective, individual decision that the cost of speaking was too high. That picture, that expanding circle of knowledge and silence, is one of the most troubling legacies of the Tara Grinstead case. It is troubling not because it is unique, because unfortunately it is not unique. Cold cases across the country persist in part because communities hold information that they do not share with investigators, but because it is so specific and so concrete and so directly connected to the suffering of a specific family. Every person who heard something and said nothing was, in some measure, making a choice that extended Carlton Grinstead's years of unanswered grief. Every person who calculated that the social cost of coming forward was greater than the moral cost of staying silent was making a choice that kept Tara hid in a field in Ben Hill County for another year, another month, another day. Ryan Duke, in the years after his guilty plea and sentencing, also became the subject of ongoing legal attention. His case produced developments that were both legally significant and publicly controversial. Developments that touched on the fundamental questions of what had actually happened on the night of October 21, 2005, and what the full truth of his intentions and actions had been. The most significant of these developments came in the form of a legal challenge that Duke's attorneys mounted in the years after his conviction, a challenge that attracted significant attention from the legal community and from the public that had followed the case. The nature of this challenge, which touched on the circumstances of his confession and the specific legal determinations that had formed the foundation of his guilty plea, was complex and procedurally intricate, but its implications were clear and significant. And the way it moved through the courts in the years after the conviction added another chapter to a legal story that had already been longer and more complicated than most people had anticipated. In parallel with the ongoing legal proceedings, the broader conversation about what the Tara Grinstead case meant and what it had revealed continued in the public sphere. The true crime community that had followed the case for years produced documentaries, podcasts, articles, and long-form analysis that attempted to make sense of everything that had happened. Some of these were thoughtful and careful, genuinely illuminating explorations of the case and its implications. Others were less careful, more sensational, more interested in the dramatic elements of the story than in the human beings at its center. Tara's family, and Anita Grinstead in particular, remained engaged with the public discussion of the case, pushing back where the coverage was inaccurate or disrespectful and supporting where it was thoughtful and fair. Anita had developed over the years of public advocacy a particular skill at navigating the often complex and sometimes exploitative world of true crime media, at protecting her sister's memory and her family's dignity, while still engaging with the public interest in the case, and had kept it alive through the years of the investigation. She spoke frequently and publicly about the importance of remembering Tara as a person rather than as a case, about the difference between honoring someone's memory and exploiting their tragedy, about the specific discomfort of being the family member of a famous crime victim, of having your grief and your sister's death be the subject of entertainment and speculation and commercial interest. She navigated that discomfort with grace and clarity, drawing the lines that needed to be drawn while remaining open to the genuine public engagement with Tara's story that she understood as part of the ongoing effort to ensure her sister was not forgotten. The Tara Grinstead Foundation continued its work through the post-conviction years, growing and developing in ways that writ the community's ongoing commitment to honoring Tara's legacy. Scholarships were awarded to students at Irwin County High School and the surrounding area, students who were reaching for futures that Tara herself had devoted her career to helping young people reach for. The foundation held events, organized community activities, maintained a presence in the life of Ocilla that was about Tara the teacher and Tara the community member rather than Tara the victim. That distinction between Tara the victim and Tara the person is one that the foundation worked consciously and deliberately to maintain. It is an important distinction. The coverage of violent crime has a tendency to reduce victims to their victimhood, to define them entirely by the worst thing that happened to them, to allow the circumstances of their death to eclipse the full reality of their life. The foundation and Anita's ongoing public advocacy were a constant counter to that tendency, a constant insistence that Tara Grinstead was a teacher, a mentor, a daughter, a sister, a community member, a woman with dreams and plans and a life she had built with care and love and hard work. She was also a murder victim. But that was the last thing she was, not the only thing. Let us talk now about the investigation's broader significance, about what the Tara Grinstead case revealed, and what it continues to mean for the practice of cold case investigation in the United States. Because the case has had a genuine and lasting impact on how investigators approach long-running unsolved crimes, and that impact is part of the full story of what Tara's case produced in the world. The single most important lesson of the Tara Grinstead investigation, the lesson that investigators and cold case specialists have pointed to most consistently in discussing the case, is the importance of preserving physical evidence for future forensic analysis. The latex glove found near Tara's house in October 2005 had been preserved carefully through more than a decade of investigation. The forensic technology available in 2005 had been unable to extract a definitive DNA profile from it. The technology available in 2017 was substantially more powerful, and the profile that was eventually extracted from that glove became a critical piece of the case against Ryan Duke. This is a principle that has implications for cold case investigations across the country. There are thousands of unsolved homicide cases in the United States in which physical evidence was collected in the early days of the investigation. Evidence that the technology of the time could not fully analyze. Evidence that has been sitting in storage waiting for the science to catch up. The Tara Grinstead case is a powerful demonstration of what happens when that evidence is preserved and revisited with better tools. It is an argument for patience, for careful preservation, for the understanding that a case that cannot be solved today might be solvable 10 or 15 years from now if the physical evidence is kept intact. The second major lesson of the case is about the role of community information in cold case resolution. The tip that broke the case in January 2017 came not from a forensic breakthrough, not from a new piece of physical evidence, not from the work of investigators following a trail that had gone cold. It came from a human being who heard something and made the decision to report it. The case was solved ultimately by a conversation and by the moral courage of the person who decided that what they had heard needed to be shared with law enforcement. This has implications for how investigators approach cold cases, for the importance of maintaining community relationships and tip lines, and the channels through which information from the public can reach the people who need to act on it. It has implications for the culture of small communities, for the specific ways in which the social dynamics of interconnected communities can both shield perpetrators and eventually expose them. And it has implications for the individual human beings who find themselves in possession of information about a crime, who face the calculation between the social cost of coming forward and the moral cost of staying silent. Heath Dykes, the man who reported Ryan Duke's confession to the GBI, has said that he knew what reporting it would cost him. He knew the social consequences of going to law enforcement in a small community, where the people involved were known to everyone. He knew that coming forward would change his life in ways that were difficult to fully anticipate. And he came forward anyway. That decision, whatever else is said about the culture of silence that surrounded the case for 11 years, was an act of genuine moral courage. And it is the act that made everything else possible. The third lesson of the Tara Grinstead case is about the long-term impact of unsolved crimes on the communities where they occur. Ocilla, Georgia, lived inside the unanswered question of what had happened to Tara for more than a decade, and that sustained uncertainty had real and lasting effects on the social fabric of the community. The erosion of trust, the persistent suspicion, the specific damage done to Marcus Harper, and potentially to others who were looked at by investigators or whispered about by neighbors. The collective grief of a community that could not fully mourn, because there was no confirmed answer. All of these were costs that accumulated over 11 years, and that left marks that did not disappear with the arrests. Small communities are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of sustained damage. They do not have the social distance and the anonymity of larger places. In Ocilla, everyone knew Tara. Everyone knew her colleagues and her students and her family. Everyone was, in some degree, directly touched by her absence. And everyone lived, for 11 years, inside the shadow of an unanswered question that colored every interaction and every relationship and every moment of daily life. The resolution of the case, when it came, brought relief, but it did not reverse the damage. The community that emerged on the other side of Ryan Duke's arrest and conviction was not the same community that had existed before October 2005. It had been changed permanently by what had happened and by the 11 years of living with the question. That change is part of the cost. It is part of what Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes did to Ocilla. Not just to Tara and her family, but to the entire community that loved her and was left without her. Now I want to take you somewhere that these stories don't always go. I want to take you into the classroom. Not the empty classroom, not the room with the photograph on the wall and the desk where she used to stand. I want to take you into the classroom as it existed when Tara was alive, when she was present, when the room was full of the particular energy that she brought to every space she inhabited. It is a fall morning in Ocilla, Georgia. The light comes through the classroom windows at the low, golden angle of October in the south, and it falls across the rows of desks where the students of Irwin County High School are settling in for another day. They come in the way teenagers always come into a classroom, with the slouch and the shuffle and the careful social performance of people who are not yet sure who they are, who are figuring out in real time, in public, in the particular crucible of high school. And then Tara Grinstead walks in. She walks in the way she walks everywhere, with the composed, warm energy of someone who is completely at ease in the space, who loves this space, who has chosen this space as the place where she will spend her best hours and her best effort. She looks at the room and she sees the students, not as a group, not as a class, but as individuals. She sees the kid in the back who is struggling with the material and needs a different approach. She sees the kid in the front who is bored because the material isn't challenging enough. She sees the kid in the middle who had a hard morning and needs a moment before they can be reached. She sees all of this, takes it in with the practiced perception of a great teacher, and she begins. She teaches history. She teaches it the way it should be taught, not as a series of dates and names to be memorized, but as a living story. The ongoing story of human beings making choices under pressure and living with the consequences. The story of how the world became what it is, and how it might become something different. She makes the past feel urgent. She makes the dead feel present. She makes students who came in slouching and shuffling sit up in their chairs, lean forward. Forget for a moment that they are 17 and self-conscious and uncertain, because something she is saying is genuinely interesting, and they cannot help themselves. That is the gift. That is what great teachers have that cannot be manufactured or replicated or replaced. The ability to make something matter to someone who was not sure they cared. The ability to reach through the particular defenses of adolescence and touch something real. Tara had that gift. She had it completely and generously and without reservation. And she gave it to every student who walked through her door, regardless of how prepared or unprepared they were, regardless of how much or how little they initially cared, regardless of what was happening in their lives outside the classroom that made it difficult to be present inside it. Former students, speaking decades later, returned to the same images again and again. The way she remembered things. The way she followed up days or weeks after a conversation, with a reference to something the student had told her, a demonstration that she had heard it and kept it. The way she showed up at things, not because she had to but because she wanted to. The way she made the work of getting education feel like something worth doing, like something that mattered and would continue to matter long after the grades were recorded and the diplomas were handed out. These are not small things. These are the things that shape lives. The teacher who made you believe in yourself at 16, who pushed you toward a goal you weren't sure you could reach, who showed up and paid attention, and refused to give up on you. That teacher stays with you. They become part of the architecture of who you are. They are present in the decisions you make and the risks you take, and the moments when you tell yourself that you are capable of more than you think. Tara Grinstead is present, in exactly that way, in the lives of the students she taught. She is present in the choices they made about their educations, their careers, their communities. She is present in the way they treat the young people in their own lives, in the standards they hold themselves to, in the specific kindness they know how to offer, because they received it from her. She did not die without leaving something in the world. She left something in dozens of lives, hundreds of lives, the lives of every student who passed through her classroom over the more than a decade she taught at Irwin County High School. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. It is the only kind of immortality that actually works, the immortality of influence, of the permanent marks that one human being leaves on the lives of others, marks that persist and propagate long after the person who made them is gone. Tara Grinstead lives in that. In the student who became a teacher because of her. In the student who went to college because she pushed them to apply. In the student who got through a hard year because Tara noticed they were struggling and stayed after class and sat with them until they were okay. In the student who coaches a little league team now and finds themselves saying something to a struggling kid that sounds exactly like something Tara once said to them. She lives there. She lives in the foundation that bears her name, and the scholarships it gives and the futures those scholarships help to build. She lives in the memory of every person who loved her, and was loved by her, and carries the specific shape of her warmth in some permanent corner of who they are. That is what was taken on October 21st, 2005. Not just a life, though a life is everything, but the ongoing future of a woman who was still growing, still reaching. Full impact on the world was not yet complete. The students she had not yet taught. The lives she had not yet touched. The changes she might have made in herself and in the world in the years and decades she should have had. That is the full cost. That is the number that can never be calculated. The question of how we remember cases like this, how we tell the stories of people who were killed and hidden and eventually found, is one that the true crime genre as a whole continues to wrestle with. There is a tension, a genuine and important tension, between the public interest in these stories and the humanity of the people at their center, between the value of keeping cases alive through public attention and the risk of reducing the people at the center of those cases to their worst moments, between the legitimate function of true crime as a form of accountability journalism and the ways in which it can slide into something less honorable, something that treats suffering as entertainment and grief as content. The Tara Grinstead case sits in that tension. It has been covered and discussed and analyzed and dramatized in many formats over the years, and not all of that coverage has honored Tara the person as fully as it has explored Tara the case. Some of it has been thoughtful and careful and genuinely illuminating. Some of it has been less so. Tara's family has navigated that landscape with grace and determination, always pulling the conversation back toward the person, always insisting that the woman at the center of the story be seen and remembered in her fullness. That insistence is right. It is necessary. And it is something that everyone who tells this story, in any format, owes to Tara and to her family. She was not a case. She was not a mystery to be solved. She was not content. She was a human being who loved her students, and her community, and her family, and her life, and who deserved every year that was taken from her, and who deserves to be remembered, first and last and always, as the specific, irreplaceable, wonderful person that she was. Now let me bring you to one of the most emotionally significant moments in the entire legal journey of this case. The victim impact statements. Because in the formal language of the sentencing proceedings, in the space that the law provides for the people who loved the victim to speak about what was done to them and what it cost, some of the most powerful and most human words in the entire story of the Tara Grinstead case were spoken. Victim impact statements are one of the places in the legal process where the humanity of the people involved breaks through the formal, procedural language of the law. They are the moment when the family members and the loved ones of the person who was killed are given the floor, given the space to speak directly to the court, directly to the defendant, directly to the world about what the crime took from them and what it cost them, and what they want the record to show about the person who was lost. The statements made in connection with the sentencing proceedings in the Tara Grinstead case were, by all accounts, deeply moving and deeply powerful. Anita Grinstead, speaking for the family, laid out the full weight of what had been taken. She spoke about Tara as a sister, as a daughter, as a teacher, as a friend. She spoke about the 11 years of not knowing. She spoke about her father, about Carlton Grinstead, about what the years of searching had cost him, and about the injustice of his dying before the answer came. She spoke about the specific, daily, ongoing nature of grief, about the way it does not follow the arc that people who have not experienced it sometimes imagine, the way it does not get steadily better over time, but rather changes shape, becomes different rather than smaller, inhabits new spaces in your life as the years pass. She spoke about what she wanted the court and the defendant and the world to understand about Tara, about who her sister had been, about the specific qualities that had made Tara who she was, the warmth and the intelligence and the commitment to her students, and the love she had for the people in her life. About the plans Tara had made for her future, and the future she never got to live. Those words, spoken in a courtroom in Georgia, in the formal proceeding that represented the legal conclusion of a journey that begun on a Friday night in October 2005, were among the most important words in the entire story. Because they were the words that insisted, in the face of everything, on the full humanity of the person at the center of it all. They were the words that said, to the defendant and to the court and to everyone who was listening, that the person you killed was not a case. She was my sister. She was our teacher. She was a human being who deserved to live. Those words cannot undo what was done. They cannot give back the years. They cannot bring Tara back or give Carlton Grinstead the closure he deserved or heal the wound that Oscilla has been carrying since October 2005. But they can insist, with full force and full dignity, that what was done matters, that the person it was done to matters, that the life that was taken was a life of extraordinary value, and the loss of it is a loss that will be felt for generations. That insistence is itself a form of justice. Not the only form, not a substitute for the legal accountability that was also pursued and achieved, but a form that is uniquely and irreplaceably human. The insistence that the dead be remembered, that they be named and known and honored, that the full weight of what their absence cost be acknowledged and carried and never forgotten. Tara Grinstead is remembered. She is named and known and honored. The full weight of her absence is carried by every person who loved her, by the community that grew up in her warmth and has lived without it for 20 years, by the students whose lives she changed and who carry her with them into every room they enter. She is not forgotten. She will not be forgotten. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to the people of Oscilla, Georgia, not the grief of the family, which is total and reshaping in ways only they can understand, and not the grief of a distant public. The grief of Oscilla is something different. It is the grief of a community that lost one of its own and had to keep living inside the unanswered question for 11 years. Tara Grinstead was 36 years old when she was taken. She was a teacher and a coach and a daughter and a sister, and a woman who had built something real and good in a small town that needed people like her. She had plans. She had students who needed her. She had a future she was reaching toward with the quiet, steady determination that had defined everything she had ever done. Ryan Duke took that future on a Friday night in October 2005. He walked into her home wearing latex gloves and he ended her life, and he called Bo Dukes, and together they drove her to a field in Ben Hill County and burned what remained of her in the dark. And then they went home, and for 11 years the world went on without Tara in it, and the people who loved her had no grave to stand at, no answer to hold, nothing to bury except the hope that she might somehow still be alive. Carlton Grinstead died without knowing. That fact belongs permanently in accounting of what this crime cost. A father who spent the last decade of his life looking for his daughter, and ran out of time months before the answer finally came. There is no way to soften that. There is no frame that makes it easier to hold. Ryan Duke is in prison for the rest of his life. Bo Dukes is serving 25 years. The law did what the law can do. It assigned consequence. It established accountability. It put names on the record beside what was done. But Tara is still gone. The classroom is still missing her, the students she would have taught, the lives she would have changed, the years she would have lived. Those are still absent from the world in a way that no verdict and no sentence can repair. What remains is her memory, the foundation that bears her name, the scholarships given to students in South Georgia who are reaching for futures that Tara herself would have cheered for, the former students who became teachers because of her, the community that carries her imperfectly and permanently, in the shape of who it is and who it is still becoming. Tara Grinstead deserved more than 36 years. She deserved all of it. And the least we can do, the very least, is remember her fully. Not as a case, not as a headline, as a teacher. As a woman. As someone who loved the young people in her care with everything she had. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story moved you, please leave a comment and subscribe. Good night, and stay safe.